One of the things that I really love about Paul is that he almost has this almost arrogant confidence in where his call came from and his response to God and not to other people. I mean, that's essentially what he was doing in chapter 1. Was he's like, I'm not here to please people, and I'm not commissioned by people, I'm commissioned by God. And so after he kind of establishes that in chapter 1, we pick up in chapter 2 where he's telling a story about a time that he went to Jerusalem, which could have been, and I kind of think that it might have been what took place in the very beginning of Acts chapter 15, where Paul and Barnabas are in Jerusalem and the Judaizers are there and they get into a fight. But he goes, I came down to Jerusalem to kind of let the church in Jerusalem know what we were doing with the Gentile nations and kind of the gospel we were teaching. He's like, not to get approval, but just to let them know and have communication, open line of communication, and just keep them in the loop. He goes, and I brought with me my friend Titus, who was a Gentile and who wasn't circumcised. And no one had a problem with it. James didn't have a problem. Peter didn't have a problem. John didn't have a problem. He goes, nobody had a problem. He goes, in fact, the circumcision thing wouldn't even have been brought up. He says in verse 4 of chapter 2, he goes, even that question of circumcision wouldn't have come up except for some so-called Christians there. Some false ones, really, who came to spy on us and see our freedom in Christ Jesus. They wanted to force us like slaves to follow their Jewish regulations, but we refused to listen to them for a single moment. We wanted to preserve the truth of the good news for you. And I'm just like, wow, Paul. Like he gets more and more aggressive, it almost seems like, as the letter goes on. But some of you might be thinking, and it's understandable, like, Paul, why do you care so much? Like, why is this the hill you chose to die on here? Because really, like, nobody's saying that it's not Jesus. Nobody's saying that there's not justification through faith. They're just saying, why don't we also get circumcised? Why don't we also keep the Jewish law? You know, that thing that God gave to us? Why is that such a big deal? And honestly, when you're sitting there, you kind of go, I don't know. Why is that such a big deal, Paul? But he goes on and he starts telling the story about when Peter came up to Antioch sometime after, but before the Jewish council met in Acts chapter 15, that I think really explains and drives the point home. So he says Peter came up to Antioch, which is a mostly Gentile church because it was not in a very Jewish area, not like Jerusalem. So it was mostly Gentiles. And he goes, when Peter came up there, he was living his best Gentile life, man. He was eating with the Gentiles. He was hanging out with the Gentiles. He was living like a Gentile. It was grand for him. But he goes, there was a point where James and some of their friends from Jerusalem came up. And he goes, and when that happened, Peter changed. He all of a sudden didn't sit with the Gentiles. He didn't eat with the Gentiles. He didn't want anything to do with the Gentiles. And so the worst part of it for Paul was not only did Peter do that, but then the others who came with Peter started doing that. Then all of a sudden Barnabas, the one who'd gone around with Peter or Paul on his missionary journeys, started following Peter. And that was when Paul said, that's it, this is enough. And so he gets up in the middle of this. He goes in 14, when I saw that they were not following the truth of the good news, I said to Peter in front of all of the others. And so imagine you're sitting there, you're like one of the Gentiles or something, and all of a sudden Paul just like slams his chair back and he gets up, starts storming across the room, and everyone's silent, and you're sitting there going like, oh no, Paul, like this is not the time. Don't bring this up, please. And he goes over and he gets right in Peter's face and he says, hey, since you, a Jew by birth, have discarded the Jewish laws and are living like a Gentile, why are you trying to make the Gentiles obey the Jewish laws you've abandoned? To which I imagine Peter was probably going like, dude, shut up. Not now, not the time. I'm in front of my guys here. Like, don't do this. But he goes on, he goes, you and I are Jews by birth, not sinners like the Gentiles, which I think really must have really struck the Jews there, because this is ultimately what they were thinking, but none of them wanted to admit it. He goes, but we're Jews, not sinners like the Gentiles, and yet we Jewish Christians know that we become right with God, not by doing what the law commands, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be accepted by God because of our faith in Christ, and not because we have obeyed the law. For no one will ever be saved by obeying the law. And so this is the point for Paul. He goes, look, right now, if we continue down this path, if we start doing this, you got to obey these rules or these laws, you got to get circumcised or whatever. He's like, we're going to have circumcised and uncircumcised, Jewish and Gentiles. And he's like, we're going to have divisions. And that's not what Jesus was about. To Paul, Jesus was about inclusion, not exclusion. He was about bringing people together, not segregating, not making separations, not delegating into different areas. Jesus was about bringing into one big family everyone that would believe. Not just like two families coming together like in-laws when someone gets married, but two people who become one family, brothers and sisters with each other. And Paul knew if we went down this path, if we go down this path, we're forever going to have these divisions within Christianity. Sadly, today, that's what's happened. But it even happened back in the first century world. And so Paul will go on to, now that he's laid the foundation, to really drive in what he believes justification by faith is and what he believes the true gospel to be. And that's what we'll pick up with tomorrow. But I want to leave you with this question. Are there times where you realize the things that you do look just like what Peter did, where you are actually excluding people, you're creating divisions within friend groups, within churches, within Christianity? Look around and think about the churches that you see in your community. How do we, instead of bringing unity, instead segregate and distance ourselves from each other? And what things could we possibly do to bring that together, to try to solve that problem? And so tomorrow we'll read, picking up in verse 17, but I hope you guys have a wonderful day.